of the rim. Garnett on the slam. Oh, here's a Curry way downtown. Oh, what a shot from Curry.
Game 7s do more than almost any other feature in the NBA to shape the league you experience and its history. Teams may go into the summer making different decisions depending on the results. New playoff matchups are decided, legacies are affected. All in one game, a new timeline branches directly before us. With the 2024 playoffs getting underway here in a few days, I wanted to take a trip into history and go through all 71 Game 7s that have taken place since the year 2000, including a few Game 5s that took place when it was the furthest a first round could go. Although I'll be paying less attention to those. The goal is to present you what happened in the game, how it affected that particular playoffs, the teams, and what might have happened if the results were different. So lock in for the next half hour and learn a bit about how these do or die scenarios shape the NBA you've grown up with. Beginning with Knicks Heat in 2000 is actually quite convenient, given a lot of you probably saw my last video. If you happen to be unaware of the context, Miami had been losing to New York for years leading up to this, with some of history's most recognizable brawls along the way. Long story short, they were the reason Hardaway and Mourning really couldn't never break out in the 90s East despite some fantastic regular season showings. Here in 2000, for the third straight postseason, Van Gundy would lead his squad to outdo his predecessor in a Game 7. As you likely recall, it was more or less the official end of Miami's duo, given Alonzo Mourning's kidney ailments would kick in soon after. It would ultimately set in motion the next phase of Miami Heat basketball. In terms of Game 5s, you had the Jazz and Sonics fight for the right to suffer against Portland. Meanwhile, very rarely remembered, the Lakers and Kings went all the way a couple of years before the infamous series. Yes, in 2000, the Lakers, featuring possibly the most dominant version of Shaq, were at risk of being first rounded. So were their eventual finals matchup, by the way. Indy 2 brushed shoulders with death against Milwaukee at the very start. A couple weeks later, Los Angeles and Portland would tango for the right to represent the West in the NBA Finals. The special context I view this game in is Kobe and Shaq were still at the beginning of figuring things out, with Bryant having officially broken out as a superstar. Aiding them was the fact the defending champion San Antonio Spurs had been knocked out of the first round with Tim Duncan sidelined. Fresh off a sweep in '99, LA would totally avoid overcoming that hurdle for now, only having to topple a gritty Trailblazers team, which they very nearly didn't do. Portland led by 13 headed into the final quarter of action, with Phil Jackson choosing to tell his team something along the lines of, quote, "I guess we aren't good enough." Predictably, like a scene straight out of a movie, the Lakers finished on a 31-13 run, with the Blazers unable to score for 7 minutes and 30 seconds. It all culminated in one of the most iconic plays of all time, with Kobe connecting on a lob off a cross to Shaq. The win would enable their first NBA Finals appearance to kick off a three-peat and one of the most dominant eras ever. I'm inclined to believe those two still win at some point even if they'd lost the deciding match, though given how icy their relationship became and the trials they'd face in 2002, who can say for sure what comes of the famed duo if they burned out in the West for a second straight run. 2001 provided two Game 5s, with the Mavericks outlasting one of Utah's obscure Malone and Stockton squads and New York essentially being put to bed for good. In the semis, because Toronto outlasted the Knicks, Iverson and Vince got into a battle for the rights to a conference finals spot. It resulted in one of the most heartbreaking misses you'll ever see in a playoff game, Carter just narrowly whiffing on a chance to send the MVP packing. On the same day, Milwaukee disposed of Charlotte for their ticket to round 3. Thus, yeah, another Game 7 between the Bucks and Sixers, to cap off a rather unknown case of one team claiming the series was rigged. Even so, I don't know if these Game 7s matter too much. Literally any of the alternate finals teams against LA still sounds like a wash given the only game they'd lose all playoffs came at the hands of Iverson's explosion. Speaking of, him getting far enough to author that performance gave us some iconic moments and no doubt affected the perception of his career forever. Moving right on to 02, yet another case of Los Angeles nearly biting the dust in one of their 3 title runs. Not before multiple Game 5s where San Antonio got by Seattle, New Jersey outpaced Indiana, Detroit eked one out over the Carterless Raptors, and Boston dethroned the reigning conference champs. All left to feel rather inconsequential on year 3 of Kobe and Shaq's run. In the conference finals, they just barely survived some narrow situations where Sacramento could have begun wrapping things up, including Game 6, which remains the most questionably refed playoff game of all time. The foul calls take up so much discourse in hindsight, it's rarely ever mentioned there was in fact a Game 7 featuring overtime, with Los Angeles just pulling through and advancing to their 3rd straight NBA Finals. I believe this series to be the most history-altering outcome we've encountered so far. Sure, losing to Portland years earlier could have had similar effects, but it took place at the beginning of Kobe and Shaq's story. Losing to Sacramento, who'd been desperate to break through this many years in? When you consider 2003 presenting another loss to San Antonio, capturing their final title in 02 was vastly important, and very well could be the reason the Kings remain a ringless franchise today. Portland returned in 03 to push the eventual conference champion runner-up 7 games in round 1. Dirk put on a masterclass as he and Nash began to build momentum. Meanwhile, on the same day, Detroit had fought back down 3-1 against McGrady's Orlando Magic to advance to the second round, adding to a lengthy era where T-Mac would never emerge from the first round in his prime, also beginning a horrid track record for Coach Doc Rivers. The Pistons were still a year out from acquiring Rasheed Wallace and going to the finals, yet one has to wonder how losing to an inferior Magic team here would have caused things to play out. 2003 kicked off the first of 6 straight conference finals runs from the unit, which weirdly granted them the face of the East during this time period, even though they only made 2 finals. Speaking of which, neither Dallas nor Sacramento would make it there after their second round Game 7, where Dirk would once again come up big. Cool series and crazy showing from Nick Van Exel, though once again, I'm not convinced either participant was capable of dealing with San Antonio. It's certainly up for debate given Dirk only got to play half the series and it still went 6. I'm just choosing to trust the Spurs regardless given their track record in big moments. By 2004, Miami had recovered from the Mourning Hardaway era, giving birth to the Wade timeline that carried South Beach for a little over another decade. After he dropped in the Game 1 dagger, Miami would finish Charlotte in a 7th game to advance to the semifinals, showing pretty solid evidence their young star was every bit worth the 5th pick, and allowing Riley to eventually greenlight a movement strongly based around him. Almost exactly 2 weeks later, league MVP Kevin Garnett was at risk of falling to Sacramento, who were placed in another Game 7 situation. Of course, it meant another bout of heartbreak when Chris Webber cruelly missed the game-tying 3 to force overtime. If you're keeping up, this was their 3rd straight year of losing a Game 7, with time beginning to run out for Webber. If you date back to 2000, they had lost a do-or-die scenario 4 out of those 5 seasons. Ouch. Regardless, the consolation prize here was facing a Lakers super team attempt who'd already conquered the nemesis in Texas and were madly hunting a 4th title. It didn't help Minnesota when Sam Cassell did his sack celebration following a big shot, leading to an avulsion fracture in his hip, limiting him to 4 games against Los Angeles, an absence Minnesota absolutely could not afford. Who knows what a Wolves-Pistons finals looks like with Garnett at the height of his powers. With them on topic, one day after the Wolves elimination match, Detroit decimated New Jersey during Game 7 after a Game 6 they came within a hair of losing. Really, Games 5 and 6 are the actual stories here. The Nets had a golden ticket to play in their 3rd straight finals and just lost it. Very much a difference maker given the 04 Lakers would have beaten anybody else. Detroit advancing here officially put an end to Kobe and Shaq, while also granting Motor City its only championship in the last 20 years. Still, we all know pretty well those two were likely done no matter what, the only difference being their ending ring count together. The 2005 Pacers were kind of already cooked from the malice, an event ending their serious contending days and ruining Reggie Miller's final runs. So the fact they were taken 7 in the first round by Boston more or less speaks for itself. On the same day, on the other side of the bracket, Houston failed to overcome Dallas, keeping T-Mac a second-round virgin despite the trade to pair him with Yao Ming, and once again, neither team was likely to change San Antonio's eventual run. It would have been nice to witness prime T-Mac attempting to post a Duncan though. Talking about the Spurs, shortly we'll be discussing the first finals Game 7 on the list, made possible by Detroit eliminating Miami in Game 7 on their home floor. Wade and Shaq in their first year proved more than capable of getting it done, only Flash had injured his ribs in Game 5, holding him out of Game 6 and hampering his production for the 7th. Through said handicaps, the Pistons bounced back to protect their conference title on the way to meet a Spurs team hunting its 3rd ring since 1999. During my last video covering Miami, I rose the question of if they'd have been capable of matching San Antonio without Wade's ailments. We're looking at a timeline where Pat potentially gets the job done out the gates, not having to swing a huge trade to push them over the top in 06. Crazy crossroads for sure. Instead, Detroit would get the honors, rubbing shoulders with a repeat as San Antonio edged out a gutsy final match to bring forth dynasty talks. It truly turned out to be the Pistons' final real shot, forever solidifying the 2004 team as something special. Recall their 06 team goes on to win 64 games. It does get interesting to imagine how the prospect of a three-peat affects their performance. I only have a hard time believing it changes anything, given they very well could have sank in Miami before these finals. Meanwhile, the Spurs continued to prove in light of all the breaks they'd gotten, there'd never been a fluke in their runs, helping the Big Three justify their futures together. In May of 2006, the post-Shaq Lakers worked their way up to a 3-1 lead against the third-seeded Suns, who were, as you well know, missing Amari Stoudemire. Fast forward a couple games, and Kobe is now being accused of quitting on his team after appearing to tone down his high volume of shooting. A Stoudemire-less Phoenix team was never going to the finals anyways, but it does beg the question of how far Kobe ends up taking his first Shaq-less playoff squad if they prevailed. Phoenix went on to play the Clippers in round 2, going 7 only to run into Dallas next. So no finals run for sure. However, I guess the big story is we were 1 game away from a Lakers-Clippers matchup which to this day has continued to evade us. It probably helps Kobe a bit as well to potentially have made the conference finals with Kwame Brown and Smush Parker as starters. Little did you know, before LeBron willed Cleveland to the finals in 07, he had the 64-win 06 Pistons on the ropes, taking them to task while Ben Wallace was still present. Game 7 wasn't close, but boy, what it would have done for him to knock the defending conference champions off and reach the conference finals in his first ever playoff run. Even better, it would have set up Cavs Heat, handing us the D-Wade-Bron playoff duel we were never fortunate enough to encounter. Those Heat certainly still go to the finals, and Detroit still loses Ben Wallace over the summer, so other than the fun duel and some more LeBron legacy banter, it doesn't rattle the timeline too much. Oof, the Game 7 24 hours later absolutely did though. The Mavs paid a visit to San Antonio for a chance to knock off the defending champions. After a bad Ginobili foul to crack the door for OT, Dirk would finish the job and conquer his demons in round 2, setting up easy pickings against Phoenix. Boy oh boy, if the Spurs, who roster-wise were probably better than the previous year, emerged from this elimination game, they probably repeat if we're being honest, setting up a chance in 07 for a very likely three-peat, making their dynasty even crazier. There was exactly 1 Game 7 in 2007, featuring the Utah Jazz and, once again, T-Max Rockets trying to escape the first round. They just barely failed to do so, falling short by 4 in the deciding match, which only interests me because of what happened next. Obviously, neither team was capable of beating San Antonio, or even Phoenix for that matter, yet the defending conference champion Mavs were no longer an issue at this point given the upset at the hands of Golden State. Utah defeating them is part of what gives me reason to believe Houston could have as well, where T-Mac and Yao potentially see a conference final showdown with their Texas counterparts. Injuries dismantled the Rockets shortly after these events, so the hypothetical likely changes nothing. It just would have been nice to see the duo at least have one respectable run to their names. My stars in heaven, why were the 66-win Big 3 2008 Celtics wrapped up in a 7-game series with the 37-win Hawks? As someone who witnessed it all, I still have no understanding. Regardless, Atlanta didn't even get close in the elimination match, only it would have been the greatest disaster for a team in NBA history if they did. We're talking about a squad who looked unbeatable from the moment they did an introductory press conference and the first inorganic Big 3 of its kind. Going out to the Hawks in round 1? Yeah, the time-space continuum would have ruptured, and I'm not even sure what moves they make over the offseason, or given Garnett's knee going out a year later, if they'd have ever even won a title. This same fear emerged 2 weeks later against LeBron, who now had taken Goliath 7 games in 2 of his last 3 postseason runs. Sure, Cleveland were defending conference champs. They were now up against a super team though, so no one took the label too seriously. Boston, by the skin of their teeth, emerged victorious at the end of a series where Ray Allen was outscored by Rajon Rondo, probably qualifying as the worst playoff series of his career. It feels like losing to LeBron in that moment at least would have played out slightly better than going home to ATL, yet history would not have been kind, and once again, James's career gets a massive boost even if he lost the very next round. Imagine a super team setting up shop in your conference while your roster barely improves, and you still somehow conquer them on the first go-around. It's insane we were ever even remotely close to this reality. A day later, the defending champion Spurs finally eliminated MVP runner-up Chris Paul, which made very little difference. Kobe was not losing in the West right after the addition of Gasol. I will say, an early conference finals appearance for CP3, who ended up having to wait another decade to make it, might have been a morale booster. Greatest playoff series of all time, anybody? The Garnettless Boston Celtics came up against a hungry Chicago team with their poised rookie point guard who gave them absolute hell. After some of the tightest, most intense affairs you'll ever witness, they escaped at the very end to see another day, avoiding becoming one of few defending champs to be sent home so early. The semifinals would present eventual conference champs in Orlando, however, so outside the embarrassment of an upset, the path really doesn't alter even if Chicago pulls it off. And for Boston without KG, it was only a matter of time regardless. Atlanta took Miami out 24 hours later after a disgusting series, really just settling the matter of who would get cooked by Cleveland. Definitely annoying still because it's another Game 7 which prevented a LeBron-Wade playoff matchup, and 2009 would have been an especially unique time for it to happen, as Wade finished third behind James in MVP voting during what was probably his best season ever. Man, '09 was a nursery for Game 7s. How about the conference champion Lakers being severely pushed by Houston, missing both its stars in round 2? It was one of those elimination games I don't reckon anybody took seriously, but to even imagine the eventual repeat champion Lakers were maybe 1 or 2 mishaps from being bounced by the Rockets leftovers so early in, barely a year after the Game 6 finals drubbing. I might have lied one time years ago saying Kobe didn't have many legacy on the line moments. This one would have done it. Not to mention it'd have meant the playoffs featuring premature Kobe and LeBron puppet commercials would have lost both characters before the finals. We'd have been looking at Nuggets magic. Speaking of, on the same day, Orlando would overcome a 3-2 deficit to dethrone the champs on their home floor. Once again, without the reigning depoy, the writing was on the wall. LeBron would have destroyed what was left of their front line in the conference finals, and we very well would have been granted the coveted Kobe and LeBron showdown. May 17th, 2009, the day both conference champions were on the chopping block. Have 2 reigning finals teams ever been sent packing in the same round on the same day? We missed something remarkable by a hair. Have you ever seen a single second of Bucks-Hawks 2010 first round? Me neither, and their 7th game had absolutely no bearings on anything coming forward. The only other series to go all the way here would be the finals rematch on LA's home floor. Simply one of the greatest, most intense battles in NBA history. And this one very much altered everything going forward. Kobe was able to surpass Shaq in ring count, capturing what turned out to be his final piece. Phil's Lakers notched another repeat, while Boston's Big Three never got another shot at the title, making the alliance somewhat of a disappointment. Bryant said himself, he simply could not be the face of a Lakers team who fell to Boston twice. Funny enough, the outcome itself nudges the league toward Miami's Big Three era regardless. With the plot already in play, Kobe getting his 5th provided that much more reason for the three to push forward with the alliance. Boston winning its 2nd title in 3 years in their conference likely provides the same motivation, meaning the dawn of the Heatles after 2010 was inevitable. The 2011 Oklahoma City Thunder were on the cusp of greatness, only a year removed from nearly taking Los Angeles 7 in round 1. Here, a 7th game with Memphis granted them a conference finals berth with only 1 season of winning basketball under their belts. Dallas certainly goes to the finals either way, and I still would like to think OKC making it this far set the table for their 2012 run. In reality, the talent was about to take them all the way independent of 2011's results. By 2012, Los Angeles had lost the spark, and the roster was reeling a bit after a failed CP3 trade. This does little to change how wild it would have been to see them first rounded by a post-Carmelo Nuggets, right on the heels of their embarrassing exit at the hands of Dallas. Unfortunately for all parties involved, an even further matured Thunder team blocked the path in the semis, so really the only thing saved here was the impact of a Kobe first round exit. Meanwhile, Lob City with their shiny new point guard had to pass the grit and grind test, only to determine who'd face a red-hot Spurs squad. In the East, however, a 7th game featuring Boston and Philly would determine who drew year 2 of the Heatles for a chance to represent the conference. Thankfully, the Celtics reinitiating the rivalry gave us a classic, and a very important crossroads in LeBron's career. Philly advances, and I doubt any of those tests take place. Actually, the 2012 conference finals would be completely forgotten by now, and one of LeBron's greatest performances ever would have just been all around unnecessary. Oh, also we wouldn't be discussing yet another Game 7, which the Heat and Celtics did partake in. After LeBron's career-saving outburst, he posted another masterclass to officially put Boston to rest, in what was a closer Game 7 than anyone really remembers. Very impactful, by the way. The series decider really became the difference in LeBron's or Durant's first ring. Not to mention Miami definitely breaks everything up and goes a different direction if they fail to reach the finals a year after losing it. So the rest of the 2010s essentially flips on its head, as does both James and Durant's career. I'm heavily assuming a much younger and faster OKC team defeats the 2012 Celtics. Wow, yeah, that series and 7th game do a lot to shape the NBA you grew up with. Yuck. A still Derrick Roseless Bulls team went 7 with Brooklyn for a right to face the 66-win defending champs in South Beach. Literally meaningless. Meanwhile, Miami then turned around to play a surprise thriller with Indy featuring its new young star. The Heat jumped on them from the start, so it never really got close. Knowing how the 2013 finals turned out though, you have to wonder what was behind the other door. Does anybody watch a Spurs-Pacers finals? Does San Antonio even struggle there? The bigger news is Miami once again failing to live up to expectations, while one of the greatest seasons ever goes to waste. Also, possibly the greatest shot in NBA history is removed, and the Heatles only ever win one title, which once again flips nearly everything we've known and lived through. In our version, the 2013 finals ended up in an all-out thriller, with James putting the finishing touches on a repeat, forever altering San Antonio's story, delivering them their first and only finals loss. Okay, now this one caught even me off guard. What were the 2014 Pacers doing in a first round Game 7 with 8th seeded Atlanta? I should have known from the start there was no chance they'd ever take Miami out. Matter of fact, the Hawks were leading 3-2 after 5. I remembered none of this. However, Indy staved off a total collapse by advancing and rightfully going to the conference finals to duel LeBron again. Yeah, Miami was beating everyone anyway, but living through the 2014 East playoffs could have been even more tragic. Indiana was literally the fill-in for Rose's Bulls in an already shallow conference. On the same day, OKC once again had a bear problem, surviving by the energy of their home court and dodging the failure of a potential finals run ending so early, especially with Westbrook returning from injury. I suspect the West result would remain the same, only San Antonio losing its best challenger on the same day the Pacers could have died would have damn near ruined the entire playoffs until the finals. Actually, one day after OKC, the Spurs faced the most random Game 7 of all time, having to put Dallas away to avoid elimination. Yes, those pictures you see of Vince Carter in one of his many random jerseys? He was part of a squad who bumped shoulders with eliminating what history has remembered as a top team ever. I'm fairly certain the Thunder just go back to the finals if for some reason Dallas got away with that. My goodness though, imagine how we think of San Antonio in this instance. After being humiliated by an 8th seed in 2011, randomly losing 4 straight in 2012 despite over a month of being undefeated, performing the worst fumble job of all time in 2013 and failing the revenge plot to Dallas's leftovers, I'll do you one even better. What if OKC had also been dealt with the day before? The remaining West teams would have been Dallas, Portland, Memphis, and the winner of Clippers Warriors. Oh yeah, addressing that. Golden State with no Andrew Bogut gave Los Angeles absolutely everything it could handle, with this year and the last showing signs they were on the horizon. The Young Guns just missed it, with the event becoming the virtual end of the Clippers-Warriors rivalry before we ever knew it. They'd never meet in the playoffs again, and Golden State would put the West in a chokehold for the remainder of the 2010s. If you're wondering what it all means, May 3rd and 4th of 2014 could have potentially cleared a path for Lob City to reach the finals with little resistance. The worst of curses couldn't have stopped them. Okay, but how about if Golden State also joins their counterparts in upsetting the higher seeds? The West then features Warriors, Mavericks, Blazers, and Grizzlies. Those would have been what was left to challenge Miami in another month. All things considered, this is a monumental day in NBA history UC has relatively flown under the radar. Or, as they say, history is written by the victors, quite literally. Also, I would like to turn your attention to the makeshift Brooklyn Nets defeating the 3rd-seeded Raptors by a point. Ultimately, either of them were food to the Heat, only it also began a long and agonizing trend of the Lowry and DeRozan Raptors underperforming. LeBronto could have started right there. More importantly, if you haven't clocked it, those were 5 Game 7s in round 1 of the 2014 playoffs, all capped off by Pitbull's iconic intro. What a time. We may or may not have already deeped the 2015 Clippers Spurs skirmish depending on the order my videos drop in. Doesn't matter. You're no doubt familiar with Paul coming in on a bum hamstring and hitting a ridiculous dagger while Blake Griffin simultaneously sent himself to the Shadow Realm. Just to a conversation we had a minute ago, now you're looking at San Antonio disappearing in round 1 a year after they very nearly disappeared in round 1. Their dynasty really hinges on a few moments here and there. In typical Clipper fashion, the game winner required Paul to play through injury in the first place, no doubt affecting the event against Houston some weeks later. You can thank the god-awful division rules for this series even existing, with the power levels being way closer to a conference finals match. The Spurs getting a couple more rolls their way no doubt gets them to the conference finals, where we could have settled the matter of how worthy the Warriors actually were, with a very good chance they add a 6th ring and beat the repeat allegations. The only other 2015 Game 7 came through in Clippers Rockets, which as you know was on the heels of a 3-1 comeback aided by events I'm convinced could only happen to the Clippers. Paul had once again fallen just short of the conference finals, and the matchup everyone wanted to see in their rivalry with Golden State. It would have been the final opportunity Los Angeles had to come out on top, and as we now know, Lob City's last realistic chance at a title. The 2016 Heat, some months after learning their season was over due to Chris Bosh's condition, went through 7 games against Charlotte exactly 0 people asked for, when the real story was Game 6, where a crowd member decided to activate what was left of Dwayne Wade's knees. Meanwhile, the second-seeded Raptors, who eventually hoped to challenge LeBron, were being taken 7 by Paul George's Pacers post-injury. Yet again, a moment where people rightfully checked out of believing they had any real shot. Where did it all lead? A semifinals do-or-die game between Miami and Toronto, where we once again lost a chance at a Wade and LeBron playoff matchup. What are we up to, 3 or 4 times now? It wasn't meant to be, bro. Nobody in the East was holding a candle to Cleveland, but out West, the Thunder had been on the verge of spoiling the greatest season of all time. After some generational fumbles and performances, a final match at Oracle would decide many fates, where Golden State slipped by what appeared to be the best remaining team in the bracket. Yes, if you're hip, you've already begun to think about how different NBA history is due to that specific Game 7. Instead of a second finals trip with the team who drafted him, Durant was sent to free agency, mulling over where he could possibly go to make it all better. 4 years removed from his last title chance. Then the finals came in and decided everything for him, as the Warriors falling short left him feeling as though he could justify joining the ops. Outside of KD for a second though, these 2 games might have done more to shape NBA history than anything before or since. The 73-9 Warriors spectacularly failed to close out LeBron 3 straight times, with James posting Herculean performances to keep his squad alive. All in one evening, we got the block, the shot, and should have gotten the greatest poster ever. The end result was James officially being able to sit at the table with the ghost he chased, allowing him to self-proclaim the GOAT title. It also marked the only 3-1 comeback in finals history. Yeah, Golden State couldn't sit with the failure, and although they were going to pursue Durant anyways, the loss made it that much easier to welcome a cheat code. LeBron, Steph, and Durant's legacies all permanently altered through these weeks, while the overall landscape of the league would be totally upended. Anybody care about or remember Jazz Clippers from 2017? No? Good. Next up was KD's Warriors, and Lob City had totally fallen off by now. Another routine injury basically guaranteed, they were cooked. The Cavs were also OP relative to their conference, but if you recall, John Wall was being touted as a potential matchup issue they might face in the postseason. It would have materialized here if Kelly Olynyk hadn't decided to peak on a career night. With 26 points on 10 of 14 shooting, Washington would miss out on their most successful run in decades. To kick off the random 2018 run sans Hayward or Kyrie, Boston would tango with the Bucks, who also appeared to be next up. They prevail, kickstarting some unexpected yet fantastic hoops against teams most fans thought outclassed them. Looking back, avoiding a first-round flameout was a massive piece to their ongoing story. Ending where it should have? It's quite possible the reintegration process in 2019 with the older stars would smoothen out a bit. Instead, a prolonged run nearly resulting in a premature finals berth changed everything about the unit, including our perspective on them. Truthfully, they easily go to the finals if LeBron gets first rounded a day later against Indiana. Cleveland would survive on a 4-point margin, which is more significant than you may think. Yes, it spared LeBron the trolling associated with a first-round exit back then, however, very similar to 2014. Imagine an Eastern Conference playoffs with no LeBron. We'd have had to sit through another month or so of the starless Celtics facing Philly, then Indy or Toronto, none of which were even remotely capable of winning a championship over Houston or Golden State. Sure, LeBron couldn't do it either, it's just losing him altogether this specific year would have made an already thought to be anticlimactic postseason so much worse. No LeBronto, no legendary Game 1 finals performance or J.R. Smith meme, and, oh yeah, a missing chapter of LeBron vs. Boston. They too went 7 for the right to be devoured by Golden State. After going back and forth and James suffering one of the few posters of his career, he added to his collection of gems featuring heartbroken fan bases. Very strange to imagine his entire 2018 playoff run almost died in April. I'm gonna guess he was praying to play Houston even if they too outmatched his supporting cast. This was nearly reality until Paul's hamstring set the path for a 7th game where they'd infamously missed 27 straight threes, still to only lose by single digits. Some curses simply never broke, and Chris Paul's is one of them. Without it, he'd be sitting on a title alongside James Harden, with one or both of them probably remaining in Houston long term. The 2018 Western Conference Finals was the NBA Finals, much like the 2007 West Semis. Remember in 2019 when Derek White came out of nowhere averaging 15 points against Denver and we collectively asked how the Spurs just kept finding guys to hoop? This is basically the extent of what I recall of their first round, where Denver was 4 points away from getting bounced as the second seed. It's also the first time most fans paid real attention to Jokic, and it was easy to be a non-believer after the post-Kawhi Spurs nearly packed them up. It all gets slightly interesting when you remember Denver then lost their 7th game to the Blazers, who everyone had long lost hope for. Do the DeRozan Spurs get to the conference finals in year 1 if they flip the script? The buck stops there regardless, as the 4-time conference champion Warriors were gatekeeping the 3rd round. In the finals, they were likely to face one of Giannis, Kawhi, or the 76ers, who'd pushed all their chips up front for a run. As we all know, in the midst of an inexplicable overall run by Leonard, Toronto would prevail through the only Game 7 walk-off buzzer beater in NBA history. It's a game where overtime probably should have occurred, and if Philly advanced, it's anybody's guess how the rest goes. Either team gives the KD-less Warriors a run for their money, no doubt, and don't let it have been Philly. The process might have completed, as opposed to 5 years later where it's stuck in the exact same spot. Avoiding said timeline, the Raptors would achieve their first title in franchise history, which was also unable to convince Kawhi to stay put. Wow, 2020's bubble had 4 Game 7s. Say what you will about the validity of it all, the hoops were absolute peak. Starting with Denver and Utah, which I will explore more completely in a greatest playoff series of all time style deep dive one day. For now, you're familiar with the sequence. Denver goes down 3-1, fans collectively let out an "I told you so" about an upstart team they were already having a hard time believing. Then they rattle off 3 straight, culminating in an outrageous 7th game where we nearly were granted another series-winning walk-off Game 7 buzzer beater. How crazy it would have been to get the second one in history a year after the first. The attempt was off by a hair, leading to an emote by Donovan Mitchell where anyone could tell the end was near for him. Utah had been a dark horse in the West all year, so a first-round choke job wasn't signaling great things for his future with the organization. Did it really change anything? I mean, possibly. We'll discuss round 2 in a sec. The now Westbrook-hardened Rockets nearly met their end to a super young OKC restart project featuring none other than Chris Paul. Aside from this relatively ignored subplot, the Beard gave us a rare defensive highlight very responsible for Houston advancing to round 2, attempting to further prove their micro ball scheme was working. In the semis, Boston played a forgotten classic against what was left of Toronto, desperate to prove they remained contenders even in the wake of Kawhi's departure. Especially because of the stoppage, I feel nobody will ever remember the 20 Raptors absolutely found a way to survive his absence. And we're still being touted as possible conference champions. Which raises the question, if they don't lose to Boston by 5, do they still make it to the finals? Can't imagine a bubble 3rd round between Miami and Toronto had any type of appeal. It still feels fun to ponder a timeline where a team loses its finals MVP and even flirts with another championship. Side note, it's hilarious the series is marked in red because Boston allegedly won a 7th game on the road. I mean, technically they did. Admittedly, either unit likely loses to Miami, and about the only thing to change would be Toronto continuing to remain delusional about the roster's future chances without rebuilding. They went on to do so for a while anyway. And wrapping back around to Denver, after becoming one of few teams to ever survive 3-1, they ran the exact script back at the Clippers, only 10 times worse. From practically eliminated, which was very expected by the way, to blowing out Doc Rivers' squad in a deciding match for the conference finals. Just like the rest of the games, Los Angeles had actually built a solid lead some way through, only to masterfully fold in a time where the world was awaiting the Battle of LA. Unfortunately, we were treated to 2 straight 3-1 comebacks from the same team. First time ever. Feels impossible in the real world, however we now know in the future Denver was just on the way to being special. In 2019, no one really cared to hear it, and another early exit here would have kept everyone asleep. They predictably came up short against the Lakers, and honestly, thankfully so. You all hated the 2023 finals. Now imagine it in the bubble when nobody thought too highly of either team. Disgusting. You do have to wonder how history would be viewed with the Battle of LA finally materializing, and what potentially happens in said series. Given it was a Rivers team and it's the Clippers, I doubt they figured the Lakers out. Still, it now serves as the closest we ever got to the series while they shared the same building, and we wouldn't have even experienced that future at the time. Reality just feels very much like the 2020 Lakers were winning the title one way or the other. The Clippers jumped straight into another Game 7 against Dallas, who they met previously in the bubble. This time, it was on the heels of having lost both home games to Luka, who appeared to be on a mission to get them up out of here. After a comeback and heroics by Kawhi, Dallas had run out of gas, with LA avoiding another collapse I'm convinced was capable of destroying the whole Kawhi PG pairing pretty early. Sadly, it makes little difference in anything due to Leonard suffering his injury shortly after, promptly ending what was their most likely championship run. Dallas sure could have made it to the conference finals though, as they do in the next season. Meanwhile, an actual history-altering event took place in round 2 when Kevin Durant's shoe size literally created a new timeline right in front of our eyes. He'd been on a tear without his co-stars, and here drained one of the toughest shots you'll ever see to win the game. As fate usually goes for the Slim Reaper, however, the shot merely yielded OT, allowing Milwaukee to keep it together long enough to prevail not only here, but progress to win it all. Just sit back and imagine a world where Durant finishes the job. He walks out with a near 50-point efficient masterclass while knocking in the toughest, most consequential series dagger ever. Their conference finals opponent ends up being Atlanta, who they very much also defeat after one or both of Kyrie and James' return, sending them to the NBA Finals where, with health, they pull out a championship in the same year they acquired Harden. Sheesh, it's slightly possible that 3 of them are still there today if it works out. Durant wins a title outside of Golden State before they win one without him. Finishing the Bucks by himself overshadows the fact he's won with the Big 3, and the entire narrative around his career changes. Alongside Giannis maybe still being ringless and possibly not even in Milwaukee today. Perusing the details, Game 7 2021 might have had as much effect as those in 2016. Oh, speaking of the Hawks, a day later, they finished Philly, who'd experienced a total meltdown, officially kicking off the end of the Simmons era. If you'll recall, ATL went on to win 2 games against the Bucks, falling out for good once Trae Young suffered his injury. We did in fact rub shoulders with a Hawks-Suns finals. Should the Sixers have done what they were supposed to? This is once again a Rivers team, combined with Ben Simmons, who we later found out Doc had no real trust in long term. I doubt they go to the finals under any circumstance. The reason Giannis may have remained ringless, as we discussed earlier, is because in 2022, he had to face a surging Boston team without the help of Chris Middleton, who began a long trend of going in and out of the lineup. It's really a wonder they even ended up taking the eventual Conference Champ 7, especially after leading 3-2 with a chance to close out in Milwaukee. I was there, and I cannot believe they survived. When they dared Grant Williams to beat them in the Garden, he did. The Celtics advanced to play Miami in the conference finals for another 7-game slugfest. Hang on, we have to go over the humiliation ritual first. Phoenix was poised to return to the NBA Finals, or at least get very close to doing so. Meeting Luka in the semis, there was hope he could make things interesting. Just, Dallas was not a title team and certainly shouldn't have been beating one. Except, he didn't just beat them, he destroyed them. That Game 7 was so bad, the organization dropped a sorry note on Twitter to explain they weren't giving up and were already working on a path forward. Luka produced a generational meme, Chris Paul produced a generational meme, and a conference champion was unequivocally gutted. Damn shame too. The Warriors had been revived, and we hadn't ever gotten to see Paul and Curry hash things out in a situation where Paul could realistically be expected to win since 2014. Knowing how potent the CP3 curse remains, who knows if Phoenix was capable of eliminating the eventual champs? But failing to even get the chance to do so was a horrific look, considering nobody respected their 2021 run either. Not to mention, we then had to suffer watching Dallas play a series they had no shot at winning. A couple weeks later, there was the Celtics, landing in Miami for a Game 7 to conquer demons. Although they did, it was in an incredibly unnecessary dramatic fashion where Butler could have and should have ruined everything following one shot. I was also present for. Being spared the embarrassment, Boston moved on to then disappoint in the finals, which, let's be real, Miami also would have done. Golden State simply wasn't losing the chance to nab one without Durant. Rightfully so when you consider the writing was on the wall and it was likely their last shot at it. This was never more evident than when the freshly minted Sacramento Kings pushed them 7, in a world where they easily had a 3-1 lead in their grasp. Curry promptly dropped 50 on 52% from the field, becoming the only player in NBA history to accomplish the feat in a 7th game, for literally 2 weeks. It only changed who was losing to the Lakers next up. Yet it was the perfect ending to a classic series, and it's too bad it seems we'll never get a rematch. On the other side, Boston was again on the chopping block, having pulled through in a Game 6 that might as well have been over. As expected with Doc Rivers teams, Philly smoked it and got smoked in Game 7 by Jason Tatum, who immediately followed Curry to become the second player in history with 50 points in a winner-go-home scenario. Knowing Philly's limitations, they weren't beating Miami next round, and neither was Boston. After falling 3-0 and facing a sweep as the first seed, they somehow mustered the energy and will to tie it up, where the gas tank was on E. Shockingly, the Celtics had failed to repeat as conference champions, allowing the Miami Heat to have the honor of dying to Denver. How much really changed? It does feel as if Boston's front office was shaking things up if they got any other result in a title, and beating the Nuggets doesn't feel realistic. So they suffer a second straight finals loss and still make the improvements leading to their current 60-win unit, who are now on the hot seat to get the job done. And now we've got the job done. Those were all the Game 7s since the year 2000, and how they've shaped the NBA we watch and love today.